Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to escape the noise, to lose myself in the deep, untamed woods. The park ranger at the entrance smiled as he handed me a map, marking the trail with a dirt-caked finger. "Be safe out there," he said, eyes narrowing in a way that should have warned me to turn back right then and there. I brushed it off as the usual spiel. I was wrong. He knew. The first night, everything was fine. My tent was pitched beside a little stream, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to block out all sound, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I let myself relax, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by an eerie, distant howl. It was far off, almost human, but just wrong. I told myself it was just a coyote, maybe a wolf. But deep down, I felt an unnatural chill that kept me from drifting back to sleep. The next day, I explored deeper into the forest. It felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The birds were silent, the air thick and still. I kept thinking I saw movement just at the edge of my vision. Shadows flitting between trees, vanishing as soon as I tried to focus on them. That evening, as I prepared a small fire, I noticed something strange. I could have sworn I saw footprints in the soft earth around my camp. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, almost like a man's but distorted, with claws extending from each toe. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was a bear, but I knew better. I'd seen bear tracks before. These were different. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing noises, whispers that sounded almost human, but came from somewhere high up, like something was watching me from the treetops. Then came the scratching, long, slow drags of claws against the bark. Whatever was out there, it wasn't shy. At dawn, I packed up and started back toward the main trail. The forest was denser than I remembered, the underbrush thicker, almost as if it were trying to keep me in. My skin prickled with every step, a sense of being hunted weighing down on me. As I pushed through a thicket, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. There, not 50 feet from me, stood something that defied explanation. It looked like a man, but its limbs were stretched impossibly long, its joints twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was as pale as bone, stretched taut over an emaciated frame, and its face, God, its face was almost human, but its eyes were hollow, empty pits, and its mouth was too wide, too full of teeth that glistened even in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature cocked its head as if studying me before it opened its mouth and let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my bones. And then, as if on cue, the woods came alive. The air filled with shrieks, growls, and snapping branches, all closing in around me. I ran, tearing through the forest, branches clawing at my skin like desperate hands trying to drag me back. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I burst into another clearing, this one littered with shredded clothing and scattered bones, bleached white and gnawed. I recognized some of the clothing, a ranger's hat, the same one I'd seen on the man who'd handed me the map. I stumbled back, barely holding down the bile rising in my throat, when I heard it again. The howling, closer this time. It sounded almost like words, garbled and twisted but unmistakable. It was calling my name. I looked up and there it was again, the same creature, but this time it wasn't alone. Flanking it were others, each more twisted and monstrous than the last. One looked like a grotesque blend of a dog and a man, its face elongated into a snout, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence. Another was hunched, almost spider-like, with limbs that bent in ways that made my skin crawl. They closed in around me, circling like vultures, their eyes never leaving mine. I felt a cold rush of realization. I was prey. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on them, until my foot caught on something. I looked down and saw a weathered backpack, the initials RT, scrawled in fading ink. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My brother, Rick, had gone missing in these woods years ago, and the search had turned up nothing. I had come here to find closure, to let go. But now, surrounded by these creatures, I understood the horrible truth. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been taken. I glanced back up, and the creatures were even closer, their twisted faces mere feet from mine. I took a step back, preparing to bolt, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see one of the creatures, but instead it was the ranger. His face was drawn and pale, his eyes hollow and lifeless, as if he were a puppet being controlled. "Welcome home," he rasped, his mouth curving into a sickening grin. And then I noticed the familiar shape of his hand, long, skeletal, with fingers that stretched too far, just like the creatures around him. The ranger wasn't a man, he'd never been a man. With dawning horror, I realized that the creatures weren't hunting me. They were waiting for me to join them. I was never leaving these woods. They would twist me, mold me, make me into one of their own. And so I ran, knowing it was hopeless, knowing I would never escape. The howling followed me, taunting me, until I tripped and fell, the creatures descending upon me like shadows. As they closed in, the last thing I heard was my own voice, twisted and echoed back at me, distorted and hollow. "Welcome home." They found my backpack months later, the initials barely visible under layers of mud and rot. They'll call it another disappearance, another lost hiker in the woods. But the truth is, I'm still here, watching, waiting. And someday they'll find someone else to take my place. Because in these woods there is no escape. There is only the hunt, the terror, and the twisted, endless dark. I can still smell the damp earth and feel the biting chill of the Whispering Pines forest. What was supposed to be an escape from the daily grind turned into a waking nightmare that I'll never fully shake off. I'll take you back to the night it all started. I was drawn to the place because of its remoteness. The Whispering Pines wasn't even on most maps. It was a few hours off any major road, deep within an old-growth forest that felt almost untouched by human hands. My friend Jake was up for an adventure, and I needed to escape the monotony of city life. Just the two of us, a tent, and a couple of backpacks stuffed with essentials. We weren't worried. We'd been camping before. The first sign that something was wrong came at dusk on the first night. We'd just finished setting up camp beside a narrow creek that snaked through the towering pines. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and decay, the kind of smell that lingers in your nostrils. The sun was setting, and long shadows stretched across the ground, transforming the forest into a dark labyrinth. As Jake gathered wood for the fire, I wandered a little further from camp, snapping photos of the forest. That's when I saw it. A figure standing among the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. I called out, thinking maybe it was another camper, but it didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the dense undergrowth, almost as if it had been absorbed by the shadows. Back at the camp, I told Jake about it, but he just laughed it off, saying I was spooking myself out. We got the fire going, and the warmth was a comfort against the growing chill. As the darkness enveloped us, the forest came alive with strange sounds, hoots, rustles, distant howls. Typical wilderness sounds, I told myself. But there was an edge to it, an unnatural harmony that made my skin crawl. We sat around the fire, telling ghost stories, laughing, trying to shake off the unease. But that's when the noises started. Not the usual forest sounds, but something else. A low, guttural growl deep in the woods. It was followed by a series of sharp, clicking noises that seemed to echo all around us. Jake froze, his face drained of color, He'd heard it too. "Probably just a bear," he whispered, but his eyes were wide with fear. We both knew it wasn't a bear. The growling stopped, but then I heard it, a voice. It sounded almost human, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. It was whispering my name. "Jake," I said, my voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" He nodded slowly, eyes locked on the dark line of trees just beyond the firelight. He heard it too. The voice was coming closer, its whispers growing louder, morphing into a twisted imitation of my own voice. Then another voice joined in, copying Jake's voice perfectly. Our fire flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe like living creatures. That's when we saw them. Creatures, hunched and twisted, emerging from the shadows. They looked almost human, but their limbs were too long, their eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Their faces were hollow, as if their features had been erased. They moved slowly, but with a predatory grace, stalking around the edge of the firelight. "Run," I whispered, and we both bolted, leaving the fire and our gear behind. We didn't know where we were going, just that we had to get away from those things. We crashed through the forest, branches clawing at our faces and arms, the darkness pressing in on us. I kept looking back, but every time I did, the creatures seemed closer, their long fingers reaching out, their glowing eyes fixed on us. We ran until we couldn't breathe, our lungs burning, our legs trembling. Finally, we collapsed by an old abandoned cabin. It looked as if it had been there for centuries, rotting away in the shadows. We had no other choice, so we pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The cabin was dark and stank of mold and something else, something foul and rotten. I struck a match, and in its brief light, I saw symbols scrawled all over the walls, strange markings that seemed to pulse and writhe in the shadows. Jake shivered, his eyes darting around the room. We huddled together in the corner, listening. The forest outside was silent now, oppressively so. It was as if every living creature had fled, leaving us alone in that dreadful place. And then, just as I started to think we might be safe, we heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, but nothing entered. I held my breath, heart pounding, as the footsteps grew louder, circling around us. I felt a cold breeze and looked up, and that's when I saw them. Shadows moving across the ceiling, unnatural and twisted, their shapes impossible to describe. Jake screamed, and then everything went black. I woke up alone in the middle of the forest with no sign of Jake or the cabin. My head was pounding, and I was covered in mud and scratches. I stumbled back to the campsite, but it was empty. Our gear was gone, the fire reduced to a pile of cold ashes. I called out for Jake, but there was no response. It was like he'd never been there at all. I managed to find my way back to the road and eventually flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man with a grim look on his face, listened as I told him what happened. He didn't seem surprised. "You're lucky you made it out," he said, his voice grave. "Most people who go into Whispering Pines don't. They say there are creatures out there, things that can steal your voice, take your face. They lure you in, make you part of the forest." As he drove away, I looked back at the dense line of trees, and I swore I saw a familiar figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was Jake, or something that looked like him, waving goodbye with a smile that wasn't quite his. I still have nightmares about that place, and sometimes in the dead of night I hear Jake's voice calling to me from the darkness. But I know better now. Whatever that thing is, it's not my friend. It's something else. Something that waits in the shadows, hungry and patient, ready for its next victim. And I'll never go back. Not to Whispering Pines. Not ever. It's funny how the wilderness feels peaceful during the day, but when the sun sets, it turns into something else entirely. A living, breathing thing that watches you. I didn't believe it at first. Not until I started working as a park ranger deep in the northern woods. They always tell you to respect the land, that it's ancient, and that some parts of it don't belong to us. I thought it was just folklore to scare rookies like me. But now, After what I've seen, I'm not so sure anymore. My post was about as remote as it gets. 2 hours to the nearest town, no cell service, just an old radio that crackled more than it talked. I'd been assigned to monitor a sector that people rarely hiked through. Dense, wild, and crawling with underbrush so thick you could barely see 5 feet ahead at times. But it wasn't just the terrain that kept people away. There were stories, whispers really, of things seen out of the corner of your eye, of voices that weren't quite right. The first few weeks were uneventful. The usual patrols, clearing trails, checking campsites. Most of the time I was alone, just me, the wind, and the rustle of trees. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started small, little things I could write off. One evening, I noticed strange tracks outside my cabin. Deep, misshapen footprints, almost human, but with toes too long, spaced too far apart. I brushed it off, assuming it was a bear or some other animal, though it didn't quite sit right. I wasn't an expert, but I knew animal tracks, and they were different. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the tree line, but the beam only hit darkness and the twisted shapes of trees. The air was still, unnervingly so. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle, I was wide awake, heart pounding. I could feel something outside, something watching. A few nights later, the whispers began. I'd be out on patrol, walking along a trail or sitting in my cabin, and I'd hear my name. Faint, but clear enough to freeze my blood. Derek, it would call, soft and slow, like a breath against my ear. But whenever I spun around, there was no one, just trees, stretching out like skeletal hands in the dim light. At first I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It had a pulse, a rhythm I could feel deep in my bones. A week passed and the whispers became more frequent. I would hear them in the middle of the day when the sun was shining, and that terrified me more than anything, because whatever was out there, it didn't care about the light. It wasn't bound by the rules I thought I understood. One night things escalated. I was finishing a late patrol when I saw it. In the distance, maybe 50 yards off, standing between the trees, someone or something, tall and lanky, its body pale, almost glowing in the moonlight. My first instinct was to call out, thinking it was a lost hiker, but as I raised my hand to wave, it turned its head toward me. Its face, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't a person, not anymore. The eyes were too large, too black, and they didn't blink. Its mouth hung open, unnaturally wide, like it was caught mid-scream, though no sound came out. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. I backed away slowly, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But when it stepped toward me, the branches beneath its feet snapping like brittle bones, I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, but when I slammed the door shut behind me, I realized I wasn't safe. It was still out there, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. I barricaded the door with a chair, not that it would stop whatever that thing was. The radio was dead. No way to call for help. And I was too far from town to hike out in the dark. That night was the longest of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, standing just outside, grinning, waiting. But the worst part, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. I started seeing them during the day, just out of the corner of my eye. A pale face between the trees, a shadow darting across the path, always just out of reach. I couldn't escape them. I was losing my mind. The final straw came a few days later. I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, like it was playing with me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I peeked out the window and my heart stopped. It was me. Standing just a few feet away, wearing my clothes, my face. But its eyes were black, empty voids that stared right into me. It smiled, a grotesque, distorted version of my own face, and whispered my name again. Derek, let me in. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, and grabbed the axe from under my bed. I wasn't going to let it take me. Whatever it was, it had been watching, waiting for the right moment. And now it was pretending to be me. As I stood there trembling, axe in hand, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around and froze. It was my partner, Tim. He was supposed to be patrolling the northern trails. But something was off. He looked wrong. His smile too wide, his eyes too dark. "You all right, Derek?" he asked, his voice too calm, too measured. "You've been acting strange." I backed away, my heart racing. That's when I noticed his reflection in the cabin window wasn't there. It wasn't Tim. None of this was real. I don't remember much after that. Just running. Running as far and as fast as I could, away from that thing pretending to be Tim, away from the doppelganger that wore my face. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station at dawn, breathless and broken. They found me wandering the road the next day, muttering to myself, the axe still clutched in my hands. I tried to explain, but no one believed me. They said I'd been alone up there the entire time. No one had come to relieve me. No one had seen Tim in weeks. But I know what I saw, that they're still out there watching, waiting. And next time they'll find someone else to wear. It was supposed to be a quick, relaxing trip. A weekend spent camping in the woods, far away from the noise of the city, far away from people. That's how it started, at least. A group of friends, a few beers and stories shared around the fire. But by the time the first night fell, things had already started to feel off. We'd chosen a remote spot in Wildwood Forest, miles from the nearest road, following a barely visible trail that wound deep into the wilderness. It was the kind of place you wouldn't find unless you were looking for it. Exactly what we wanted, secluded, untouched, no tourists, no other campers, just us and nature. The ranger at the outpost had given us a strange look when we mentioned where we were headed. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the map we'd shown him, tracing the trail with his finger. "I wouldn't camp too deep in Wildwood," he said finally, his voice low, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "That place, strange things happen there. The deeper you go, the worse it gets." We laughed it off, of course. Strange things, in the woods. That's why we were there, to escape reality for a while, to let our imaginations run wild. But the ranger's words stuck with me, even as we hiked further into the forest, our excitement mounting as we finally reached our campsite. The clearing was perfect, surrounded by tall pines, a small stream running nearby, the ground soft and flat for our tents. As the sun set, we built a fire, cracked open a few beers, and settled in for what we thought would be a fun, carefree night. But as darkness fell, the forest around us seemed to change. The light from the fire only extended so far, leaving the trees just beyond the ring of light shrouded in inky blackness. And that's when we started hearing it. At first, it was just faint, like the sound of leaves crunching or twigs snapping underfoot. We figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, foraging in the underbrush. But the sound didn't go away. It circled the camp, moving slowly, deliberately, just outside the firelight. Jenna was the first to comment on it. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her eyes scanning the dark woods. "Probably just some wildlife," I said, though I didn't believe it. The footsteps, if that's what they were, sounded too steady, too human. Still, we brushed it off and continued our conversation. But then the noises stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. No crickets, no wind, nothing. And that's when the whistling started. It came from the trees, low and soft at first, like someone trying to whistle a tune but not quite getting it right. The melody was broken, disjointed. It would start, then stop, like whoever or whatever was making it didn't know the song. We all went quiet, listening. "Is that a person?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's another camper," Jenna suggested, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "There's no one else out here," I said, and I knew I was right. We were miles from any marked trail, and we hadn't seen a single soul on our hike in. We were alone. At least, we were supposed to be. The whistling continued, growing louder, closer. It circled us just like the footsteps had, moving around the camp. But we couldn't see anything. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows, but the woods beyond the light were impenetrable. "Maybe it's a hunter," Luke said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Hunters don't whistle like that," Jenna muttered, her eyes wide, reflecting the flames. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The truth was, the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't just eerie. It was wrong. Like something was trying to imitate a human but couldn't quite get it right. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. I swept the light across the trees, searching for anything that could explain the sound. But there was nothing, just shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No answer. I stepped further into the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight flickered, just for a second, but long enough to make me stop. I tapped it against my palm, cursing the cheap batteries. And then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing between the trees. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a lost hiker or a hunter. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't right. Its arms were too long, its posture too rigid. And its face, it was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, but completely featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth white skin. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, I just stood there frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Then the whistling started again, but this time it came from the figure. It didn't have a mouth, but somehow the sound was coming from it, that same broken, disjointed melody, echoing through the trees. My flashlight flickered again, and when the beam stabilized, the figure was gone. Vanished. Like it had never been there at all. I stumbled back to the campsite, my heart racing. Luke and Jenna were both standing now, their faces pale, eyes wide. "You saw it, didn't you?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to form words. Without saying anything else, we packed up camp in record time. We didn't talk about it, didn't even look at each other, just moved as quickly as we could. By the time we were done, the first hint of dawn was creeping over the horizon. We hiked out in silence, none of us daring to look back. When we finally made it back to the car, Luke broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to explain it, but as we drove away from Wildwood Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone out there. And I couldn't forget the way that thing had stood there, watching me with a face that wasn't a face at all. I haven't been back to Wildwood since. None of us have. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear that broken, haunting whistle. And I wonder, what would have happened if I had followed it? I've been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, stationed in the dense heart of the Pacific Northwest. The forest here is ancient, full of towering trees, some older than time itself. It's a beautiful, serene place during the day, silent except for the gentle rustle of the wind through the pines and the distant calls of wildlife. At night, though, the woods take on a different character. You begin to notice things that don't make sense. I used to dismiss them, brush off the strange sensations as tricks of the mind. But not anymore. It was late October when things started happening. I was assigned to a solo patrol out near Black Hollow, a section of the forest known for its jagged cliffs and tangled undergrowth. Not many campers venture out there, too remote, too easy to get lost. Still, the occasional thrill-seeker or backcountry hiker would make the trek, and it was my job to make sure they stayed safe. I set out just before dusk, my truck bouncing over the uneven trail. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. The further I drove, the more oppressive the forest felt, as if it were closing in around me. Eventually, the road became impassable, and I parked near a clearing, deciding to hike the rest of the way to a fire lookout about 2 miles deeper into the woods. As I hiked, the temperature began to drop and the usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. I've spent countless nights alone in the woods, but this was different. This wasn't the vague paranoia of isolation. This was something specific, targeted. I stopped scanning the trees, half expecting to see a cougar or a bear, but there was nothing, just the stillness. I shook it off and pressed on. About an hour into the hike, I reached a narrow creek, the water trickling quietly over the rocks. That's when I saw the first sign something was wrong. Across the creek, maybe 20 feet away, stood a deer. At least I thought it was a deer. Its body was wrong, legs too long, unnaturally thin. Its head was lowered as if grazing, but its eyes were fixed on me. I stood frozen, staring back at it. Something about the creature made my skin crawl. Slowly, without turning its head, it began to back away, retreating into the trees. And just like that, it was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was already too far in, too committed. I pushed forward, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe the shadows had distorted its shape. I told myself 1,000 lies, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. As I neared the lookout, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees in mournful gusts. The structure stood atop a rocky outcrop, offering a panoramic view of the forest below. I climbed the creaky ladder to the top, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. Once inside, I checked the radio, but there was no signal. Figures. These old towers were notoriously unreliable. The sun had fully set by now, and darkness swallowed the landscape. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the tree line below. Everything looked still. Normal. But that feeling, the one that had followed me since the creek, had only grown stronger. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting for something. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. I focused the beam of my flashlight on the ground below the tower. At first, I thought it was just a deer again, but this time there was no mistaking it. A figure was standing there just outside the reach of the light, human-like but not human. Its limbs were elongated, its posture hunched, and its skin, pale, stretched tight over 2 thin bones. I blinked, convinced I was seeing things, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring up at me. My heart pounded in my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was some kind of animal, maybe. But no, I knew what I was looking at. This was no animal. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I grabbed the radio again, but the static was louder now, almost deafening. I turned it off, feeling a rising sense of panic. I needed to leave. Now. I bolted down the ladder, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure was gone, but the forest felt wrong. The trees seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting unnaturally. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl close behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before, the cold air burning in my lungs. But no matter how fast I went, the growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. Finally, I broke through the tree line, stumbling into the clearing where I'd left my truck. I fumbled with the keys, barely able to breathe, before finally getting the door open. I jumped inside, slamming it shut and locking the doors. The forest was deathly quiet again. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Slowly, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the lookout one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing on the roof of the tower, watching me. It was the same figure from before, pale and thin, but this time it was smiling. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I floored it, not daring to look back again. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there in Black Hollow, but I haven't been back since. I filled my report, left out the details, and transferred to another post far from those woods. I can still feel them watching sometimes, though, late at night. I'll be sitting in my cabin, alone, and the wind will start to howl. And I'll know they're out there, waiting. The forest was still. Not the peaceful kind of still where you could hear the birds and the rustling leaves. This was an oppressive, unnatural quiet, like something heavy and watchful had settled over the trees. I'd been hiking for hours, miles off the usual paths, hoping to find a hidden lake I'd read about online. I'd left just before dawn, wanting to be alone in the woods before anyone else arrived. Now, as the afternoon shadows stretched, I found myself wondering if that had been a mistake. I'd never seen trees like these before. They were taller and older than I expected, twisted and gnarled like the hands of ancient giants. I hadn't seen any animals for hours, and the forest floor was covered with a thick layer of moss that muffled my footsteps. Everything seemed a little too quiet, a little too still, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, almost too soft to notice. I stopped and listened, scanning the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but something about the sound felt wrong, too deliberate, as if it were waiting for me to move before it moved too. My heartbeat quickened as the rustling continued, closer now, and I strained my ears trying to locate it. But it was as if the sound was circling me, coming from all sides at once. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but whatever it was had already vanished. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing more than a bird or squirrel darting through the underbrush. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was hiding just beyond my sight. I started walking again, faster this time, scanning the trees with every step. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing just ahead on the trail. It was tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in shadows, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure tilted its head, and I could swear it was looking right at me, though I couldn't make out any features. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I thought I saw. But the figure was still there in my mind's eye, looming and unnatural, like something that didn't belong in this world. I turned and started to walk, then run, back the way I'd come, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't find my way back to the spot where I'd started. It was as if the forest had shifted around me, swallowing up the path I thought I knew so well. As I ran, I heard a voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words were soft, almost a sigh, but they filled me with a chill that settled deep in my bones. I stopped, my head whipping around, trying to find the source, but the trees were empty, still, and silent once more. I took a few steps forward, then froze. There, etched into the bark of a tree, was a symbol. It looked like an eye, with long, jagged lines radiating outward. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. It felt ancient, wrong, as if it didn't belong to this world. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the rough bark, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was again, the figure. Closer this time, so close I could almost make out its face, though it was shrouded in shadows. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing and unblinking, and it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The growl grew louder, filling the air with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, and turned to run, sprinting as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever that thing was. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on, desperate and terrified. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending as if they were alive, reaching out to grab me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst into a clearing. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around, hoping to see some sign of civilization. But instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a circle of stones. They were old and weathered, covered in moss and lichen, but they were arranged too perfectly to be natural. I stepped closer, my eyes drawn to the center of the circle where a small twisted figure lay. It looked like a doll made of sticks and twine. But as I stared at it, I realized that it was pulsing, as if it were alive. I took a step back, my foot catching on a root, and as I stumbled, I heard the voice again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes watching me, pressing in from all sides. I looked up, and there, at the edge of the clearing, were dozens of figures, all identical to the one I'd seen before. They stood motionless, their eyes glowing yellow, their mouths twisted into unnatural, predatory smiles. I backed away, my hands shaking, and the figures began to move, closing in around me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and I realized with horror that the stones of the circle were sinking, pulling me down with them. I struggled, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The figures drew closer, their faces blank and hollow, their hands reaching out as if to drag me down with them. As I felt myself sinking, I looked up one last time and saw a familiar face among the figures. It was the park ranger, the one who'd warned me about the stories. She stood there, her eyes glowing yellow, her smile too wide, too sharp, and I knew then that there was no escape. The forest had claimed me, just as it had claimed her, and 1,000 others before us. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the faint, mocking echo of that whisper, "You shouldn't have come." I never liked camping much, but it wasn't my idea, it was Jake's. He's always been into these rugged, back-to-nature adventures, dragging the rest of us along with him. There were 5 of us that weekend. Me, Jake, Sam, Lily, and Claire. We were all crammed into Jake's beat-up Jeep, winding down a narrow, twisting dirt road that seemed to lead straight into the belly of nowhere. We finally arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, miles deep in the pine barrens, dense, remote, and eerily silent. The kind of silence that gets under your skin. Not a single bird call, no rustling of small animals. Just nothing. But Jake was thrilled. "Perfect spot," he said with that goofy grin. The rest of us exchanged uncertain glances, but no one wanted to be the first to chicken out. We set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It was peaceful at first, but there was something off about the place. You know that feeling when you're being watched? I brushed it off as nerves. Being out here, in the middle of nowhere, tends to do that. By nightfall, the fire was crackling, and we passed around beers trying to lighten the mood. But something still felt wrong. Sam was the first to notice it. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, suddenly serious. We all fell silent. There it was, a faint whispering, barely audible, like the wind weaving through the trees. Except there wasn't any wind. We looked at each other, confused. Lily laughed it off, saying it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I could tell none of us believed her. The whispering grew louder as the night dragged on, like voices coming from all directions. But no matter where we looked, we saw nothing but the same black expanse of trees. And the silence between the whispers was suffocating. Jake tried to reassure us. "It's just the forest," he said, throwing another log on the fire. "Nature can play tricks on you when it's this quiet." But something about his voice sounded strained, like he didn't fully believe his own words. We all agreed to turn in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The tents felt too thin, too fragile, as if they couldn't protect us from whatever was out there. I lay awake, listening. The whispers were closer now, almost like they were coming from just outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Jake unzipped his tent and crawled out. I could see his silhouette against the faint glow of the dying fire. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound brave. No answer. Suddenly we all heard it, a low guttural growl from the trees. Claire screamed, and in seconds we were all out of our tents, flashlights scanning the darkness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching us. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the light, a figure, hunched and shadowy, barely visible through the dense pines. "Run!" Jake yelled, and we scattered, bolting through the forest without any sense of direction. The only thing that mattered was getting away from whatever was out there. Branches whipped against my face, the forest floor uneven beneath my feet. The growling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My legs burned, but I kept running until I couldn't hear the others anymore, couldn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing. That's when I saw it, a small cabin tucked away in the trees. It looked old, abandoned. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar. I should have kept running, but something drew me to it, like an invisible hand guiding me. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Dust covered everything. An old table, a few wooden chairs, a fireplace filled with ashes long dead. But the thing that stopped me in my tracks was the wall, covered in names, dozens, maybe hundreds of names, scratched into the wood. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. That's when I saw it. Near the bottom of the wall, scratched deep into the wood, were our names: Jake, Sam, Lily, Claire, and mine. I stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. How? How could our names already be here? The door creaked open behind me and I spun around, expecting to see the thing from the woods. But it wasn't. It was Jake, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Did you see them too?" he whispered. I didn't have time to ask what he meant. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling the cabin with their eerie, disembodied voices. And then, like a switch flipping, they stopped. Silence. Jake and I stood there frozen, waiting for something, anything. That's when the floor creaked, and from the shadows of the far corner, something stepped forward. It wasn't the creature from the woods, it was Claire, or at least it looked like her. But there was something wrong. Her eyes, they were blank, lifeless. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin, and in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Jake bolted for the door and I followed, sprinting into the night. We ran, not caring where we were going, just needing to get away. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, we realized something terrifying. The forest was quiet again. No growls, no whispers, just the wind in the trees. But Claire was gone. So was Sam and Lily. We searched for hours, calling their names, but there was no sign of them. It wasn't until dawn broke that we found their tents, empty, torn open from the inside. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what happened to the others, or if they ever made it out. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and I can't help but wonder, did they ever really leave? Or are they still out there waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into the whispering pines? I've always believed that the wilderness had a life of its own. There's something ancient about the forest, like it's been watching for centuries, holding secrets in the cracks of bark and the shadows between the trees. But even knowing that, I never expected what happened that night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, me, my girlfriend Hannah, and our friend Ryan. We weren't the type to go off the grid, but we found this place online, tucked deep in the mountains, far away from the noise of civilization. The reviews called it serene and isolated. That sounded perfect at the time. Now, I wish we had stayed far away. The drive took hours, the road narrowing to a single dirt lane as we climbed higher and deeper into the forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. The air was cool, crisp, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the wind through the pines. We set up camp quickly, the three of us working together like we had done a dozen times before. There was something comforting about the routine. Pitching the tent, gathering wood for the fire, unpacking the cooler. Everything felt normal. But as the darkness settled in, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me, like I was being watched from the trees. I didn't say anything, didn't want to ruin the vibe. But it was there, lingering at the back of my mind. We sat around the campfire, chatting, laughing, drinking. The warmth of the flames made the creeping chill of the night seem distant, but there was a strange tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the occasional crack of a twig, seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. A little too quiet. Ryan noticed it first. "You hear that?" I glanced at him, shaking my head. "Hear what?" "That's the point. There's nothing." Hannah laughed, trying to brush it off. "It's just the woods. Sometimes it gets quiet at night." But Ryan wasn't buying it, and neither was I. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. Like something was intentionally smothering the sound, draining the life from the forest around us. It was unnerving. Still, we stayed by the fire, trying to keep the conversation going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My eyes kept drifting to the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood tall and dark, the shadows between them impossibly thick. That's when we heard it. A faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was slow, deliberate, and close. Too close. "Probably just an animal," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. But then the sound came again. This time it was louder, almost rhythmic, like footsteps. Something, was circling the camp. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it into the trees, but the beam cut through only a small slice of the dark. The rest remained black, impenetrable. "Who's out there?" Ryan called, standing up. There was no response, just more rustling. A shiver ran down my spine. Then Hannah spoke, her voice low. "Guys, look at the fire." We turned. The flames were flickering wildly, sputtering as if something was sucking the oxygen out of the air. But what caught my attention was the way the light danced across the trees, their shadows. No, they weren't shadows anymore. They were moving. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking it had to be a trick of the light. But no. The dark shapes in the trees were swaying, creeping closer, bending and shifting unnaturally. They weren't just cast by the fire. They were alive, slithering through the air like they had a mind of their own. "What the hell?" Ryan whispered, backing away from the edge of the clearing. We all stood, staring, paralyzed by the sight. The darkness seemed to be seeping from the trees, coiling toward us. It wasn't just shadows. It was something else. Something wrong. The shapes weren't random. They were forming figures. Vaguely human but elongated, twisted. They moved slowly, unnaturally, almost gliding across the ground. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But as soon as I said it, the figures stopped, the rustling ceased. The fire crackled normally again. The shadows returned to being just shadows, and the air lost that heavy, suffocating feel. The sudden return to normalcy was almost worse than the creeping darkness. What just happened?" Hannah stammered, her face pale. I didn't have an answer, none of us did. We gathered our stuff, tossing it back into the tent, moving as quickly as we could. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. But there was no sense to it. As we scrambled to pack up, I heard Ryan muttering under his breath, It's watching. It's still watching. I turned to him. What are you talking about? He pointed at the tree line. His face was white, his eyes wide with fear. I followed his gaze, and my blood turned to ice. There, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure, tall, thin, with impossibly long arms that stretched down to the ground. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, smooth surface. It didn't move. It just stood there watching us or sensing us like it was waiting. Ryan grabbed his backpack, his voice trembling. We need to leave, right now. We didn't argue. We grabbed what we could and bolted for the car, not daring to look back. I could feel its presence behind us the whole time, like it was following, stalking us through the trees. We made it to the car, our breath coming in ragged gasps. As soon as the doors slammed shut, I floored the gas, speeding down the dirt road. No one said a word until we were miles away from the campsite, the forest fading into the distance. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that somehow, whatever had been watching us was still there, following, lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. And then I saw it, just a glimpse in the rearview mirror. A pale figure standing in the middle of the road, staring after us, featureless and motionless. That's when I realized the truth. The wilderness doesn't just watch, it waits. I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into a nightmare, but I suppose that's how these things always go. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for me and my girlfriend Claire to unplug from the world. We'd found this remote spot in the mountains online, one of those off-the-grid places that hardly anyone knows about. The pictures looked perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, a little stream running nearby, and best of all, no cell service. I could already feel the stress melting away as we drove deeper into the wilderness. The narrow dirt road twisted through the trees, and with each mile, the world felt further and further behind us. Claire was excited, pointing out birds and wildflowers along the way. But there was something about the road that made me uneasy. The deeper we went, the narrower and more overgrown it became. It wasn't on any of the maps we had, and there were no signs of other campers, no other cars, no signs of trails, just this seemingly forgotten path that led deeper into nowhere. We're really out here, I said with a chuckle, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping over me. Claire smiled, but even she seemed a little uneasy now. That's the point, right? To get away from it all. We finally arrived at the campsite just before sunset. It was just as secluded as the pictures had promised. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently. No trash, no worn paths, just untouched wilderness. We set up the tent quickly, trying to beat the fading light, and by the time the fire was going, the first stars were already peeking through the trees. For the first couple of hours, it was perfect. We cooked dinner over the fire, laughed, and listened to the soft sounds of the forest around us. The night air was cool, and the crackling fire was the only sound in the otherwise silent woods. But after a while, Claire started acting strange. It was subtle at first. She would stop mid-conversation, her head cocked slightly to the side like she was listening for something. I asked her what was wrong, but she just shrugged, brushing it off as nothing. Then, about an hour later, she froze. Her eyes locked onto the tree line, staring at something just beyond the fire's glow. "What is it?" I whispered, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She didn't answer for a long moment, just kept staring. Then, without looking away from the trees, she said in a low voice, "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the crackle of the fire. "I don't hear anything." Her face tightened, and she slowly stood up. "It's coming from the woods, like footsteps." I stood up too, my heart starting to race. "Claire, I don't hear anything. Maybe it's an animal." But she was already walking toward the trees, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if something was pulling her forward. I grabbed her arm before she could go any further. "Claire, wait." She snapped out of it, blinking rapidly as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard someone out there. I glanced into the dark woods, but there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint outline of the trees in the moonlight. Still, the uneasiness was growing inside me. Let's just sit back down. We're in the middle of nowhere. No one's out here. Reluctantly, she came back to the fire, but her mood had shifted. She was quieter, more distant, her eyes darting to the forest every few minutes. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. We sat in silence for a while before Claire suddenly stood up again. "I'm going to the bathroom," she said, her voice flat. I nodded, watching her walk toward the trees with a flashlight. I kept my eyes on her, feeling a strange sense of dread as she disappeared into the darkness. The seconds ticked by, and then minutes. I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping up my spine, telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the direction Claire had gone. "Claire?" I called out, but there was no response. I stood up, my heart pounding, and took a few steps toward the woods. The fire flickered behind me, casting long shadows as the footsteps grew louder. "Claire, this isn't funny," I shouted, fear gnawing at me. Then she emerged from the trees, but something was off. She was walking too slowly, her head tilted to one side, her hair falling in front of her face. The flashlight hung loosely in her hand, the beam pointing at the ground, flickering weakly. "Claire?" I asked again, my voice shaky. She stopped just at the edge of the firelight, her face still obscured by her hair. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stepped closer, but something in me screamed not to. "What did you see?" Her head slowly lifted, her eyes locking onto mine through the curtain of her hair. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too wrong. "They're waiting for us," she said, her voice unnatural, almost sing-song. I took a step back, my blood running cold. "What are you talking about?" She took a step forward, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "In the woods. They've been watching us the whole time." I stumbled back toward the tent, my mind racing. This wasn't Claire. Something was wrong. Something had changed in her. Without warning, she lunged toward me, her smile twisting into a grotesque grin as she whispered, "You can't leave. They won't let you." I scrambled backward, falling over the tent, and that's when I heard it. The same soft, deliberate footsteps I had heard before. Only this time they weren't coming from Claire. They were coming from behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and there, just at the edge of the trees, were shapes. Dark figures standing motionless in the shadows, watching us. Watching me. I don't know how I did it, but I ran. I grabbed the car keys and bolted for the car, my legs barely carrying me as the footsteps and whispers followed me through the trees. I didn't look back. I drove away that night, leaving everything behind. Claire, the tent, all of it. I told the police what happened, but they never found her. Just the campsite torn apart and the flashlight lying in the dirt. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear her voice. "They're waiting.